All right, I think it is officially time. Thank you again for coming out tonight. I know we all have quite a bit going on here, particularly with the arrival of the holidays. Um, my name is Phil Pine. I am the founder and director of a group called Capital Educators. I've been running CapEd since I founded it in 1997, so we're going on 25 years now. And I spend most of my time helping 11th graders, quite honestly, prepare to sit for the official SAT or ACT. I also give a number of mock exams like the one we administered at BCC on Saturday. And if you are on this call, there's a great chance that you or your child took that practice test. Please know that we mailed home those score reports on Monday. So I'm hoping that a good number of you have received them already. And if you haven't, they really should be arriving any day now. If somehow your scores have not arrived by next Tuesday, Wednesday, I would definitely reach out to us at the email below or the phone number below, and we can go to Plan B and try to get the score report to you another way. But even if you haven't received a score report, I promise you will be able to follow all of this perfectly well, and you should find it to be a really productive meeting. I am joined by Gracie Giordano, who is an expert CapEd instructor, teaches both the verbal and math portions of the test. She is also one of our full-time course directors. So she runs programs for us all over the area, quite a bit in Northwest DC. Gracie's here for a bunch of reasons, in part to make sure I don't have any horrible technological moments, but I think more usefully to field your questions over chat. We really would appreciate if you all would ask your questions as they come to you. I really don't want to talk at you for 52 minutes and then cram some questions in at the very end. Odds are, if you have a question in your mind, there are other people on the call who would benefit. So please chat your answer privately to Gracie, and she will know when to share it with me and with all of us in the presentation. Gracie, to simplify things, would you mind maybe sending a group chat to everyone so they just have your info pulled up on their Zooms?
Absolutely. I will send that right now.
All right, awesome. That'll make it just a touch easier. While Gracie does that, let me walk you through the plan, okay? While I am happy to answer any and all questions, I definitely have some topics I know I want to touch on. The first one is I want to talk about test optional college admissions. I don't think you can really talk about SATs or ACTs without doing that nowadays. So we'll take that on, sort of the 30,000-foot view of where college admissions are. And then we'll dive into more of the nitty-gritty. We'll talk about the SAT versus the ACT and steps the students can take to figure out which test might confer the greatest advantage for them. We'll look at specific score reports, both from the test we just administered as well as the PSAT. And then we'll talk about what's next. If you're the parent of an 11th grader, you are in the thick of it. This is the time when you're going to want to make some real concrete plans for test prep and testing. And if you're representing a sophomore, this will help you make a longer term plan, which I think will be really useful. So let's talk test optional, okay? If you've been following the news at all in testing, you know that this has been the rage for the last 2 years. The test optional movement has been in effect for many, many years, but the arrival of COVID-19 really provided some fuel to the fire and pushed test optional really to a brand new place. If you were to speak to the 12th graders right now, students in the class of 2022, many of whom just got their first college acceptance letters this week, okay? They'll tell you that they were able to apply almost anywhere they wanted this year with or without a standardized test score. Over 90% of the colleges you know and care about, okay, are currently adopting a test optional stance. Now, before diving into that in more detail, a couple of definitions. You'll see on the far left, there are actually a handful of colleges that aren't test optional, that are test blind. And these are institutions that actually go a half step further than the test optional ones. These are places that not only do not require testing, these are admissions offices that will literally turn a blind eye towards any scores that you share with them. They will not use numbers as part of their admissions process. At last count, there were roughly 36 colleges in the United States that are test blind or test free. Maybe the most glaring name on that list is that the University of California school system is experimenting with a test blind policy right now. If you go on the far right, you'll hit the other extreme. There are a few places that are still requiring testing of all their applicants. These tend to be larger southern state school institutions like those within the University of Georgia and the University of Florida, as well as the service academies. But you'll notice it's not a super long list. So the real question many of you are probably wondering, because you are representing sophomores and juniors, is how is this going to change for our kids, right? What do we expect to happen? And while it's kind of dangerous to make big time predictions nowadays with anything, my sense from talking to admissions officers and other people in testing is that there will be more schools that require testing in the next couple of years, no doubt. But I still think your sophomores and juniors will be looking at a great number of schools that are test optional, somewhere between a solid majority and an overwhelming majority, okay? Here's the why. Going test optional makes things a little more complicated in a college admissions office, but it helps the college in some pretty profound and palpable ways, okay? Here's the first thing that happens. The second a school starts to say testing is optional, it receives many, many more applications. And I think this is pretty intuitive. More students feel more emboldened to apply more places, right? There's less fear as part of the equation, which is great. The second thing colleges see that they don't advertise quite as overtly is that the incoming scores for their freshmen, the average incoming SATs and ACTs improve, somewhere between moderately and considerably. And that's because there's self-selection at play, right? The only people who are sharing scores are the ones who are happy with how they did. So look at it from a college's vantage point, right? They get more applications, which means they get a lower admit rate. They get more competitive. They have higher freshman scores, which means their ranking typically goes up in publications like US News. And they're able to accomplish those things while pursuing something that is actually enviable, okay, and noble, and that is improving equity and access. Test optional policies tend to benefit students from less affluent areas and weaker school systems more than anyone else. So for all these reasons, I think test optional is here to stay in a significant way. If that perspective doesn't excite you too much, let's talk about it more practically in terms of like how it affects our kids and how it affects us as families. For one thing, test optional means your child may have a couple of schools on their college list that wouldn't have been there 5 years ago, okay? Schools that have very, very high average incoming scores that are now plausible to apply to, whereas before they would have been numerically prohibitive. That's great. But honestly, it's this second point that's much more important. Test optional policies put way more control in a student's hands and in a family's hands. And for that reason, I'm a huge fan. Even as someone who spent the last 25 years only dealing with standardized tests, I truly believe that test optional benefits everyone, including the test preparers like us. Here's what this second point means. Hopefully your kids plan for these tests. Think about these tests, prep for them, take them. In the fall of senior year, your child will have 1, 2, 3 scores probably. What you can then decide at that time is what to do with those numbers, okay? If your student has scores that are going to be helpful to them at the colleges they're targeting, your child may be someone who sends scores literally to every college that's on your list, okay? Because you think it will make a positive impact on the admissions decision. You might be in the opposite camp though. Maybe your student can never get the scores up to the grades despite some real earnest effort, okay? That student may decide to shield their scores from every single college. And what Gracie and I have seen is that somewhere between like a quarter and a third of students nowadays end up sending their tests to some places, but not others, right? You share the scores at institutions where they'll help, you shield the scores from institutions where they won't. And so bottom line is, the only way to have more choices, the only way to be able to figure out what you want to do with those results is to actually have a test score banked. So we just don't want sophomores and juniors, okay, dismissing these tests as irrelevant because they've heard that colleges have gone test optional. It's really the opposite. You want to take them seriously and then just make some wise decisions by the time you get to 12th grade. All right, Gracie, I've done a lot of yapping, but I also haven't seen you very busy over there. Have you taken any questions in just yet?
I believe that we'll get to them in a little while, so I'll hold off on sharing them for now.
Okay, cool. Please continue to share your questions with Gracie. She's got a plan. I trust her on this. All right. Hold on one second. I'm just going to make sure my screen doesn't freeze for much longer. Okay. So what I want to do now is I want to look at what this sending versus shielding decision looks like so that this can have some context for you. And so I thought we'd look at a senior who's applying to the University of Maryland. And I picked Maryland for obvious reasons, right? It's the single most popular institution in our area. One thing that may surprise you, the average incoming scores for freshmen are pretty darn high nowadays, right? We're finding average SATs at about 1380 out of 1600. And we're finding ACT averages of about 31 out of 36. Okay. Now, let's take a look at our first student. Our first student earned an official set of scores of 1440. Maybe he pulled that off on his first sitting. Maybe it took him 2 attempts, but the bottom line is he has a 1440. For this student, the decision-making process is actually pretty darn straightforward, okay? This kid will almost certainly share his 1440 with admissions because it is way north of the average line at Maryland. It's pushing the 75th percentile. It's a high enough score that it might even, I don't know, pave the way for him to join a scholars program or an honors program. So that's not too complicated. Here's our second student. Very similar looking, but this one has a 1230. Now, before you all engage in Montgomery County, BCC, okay, micro thinking, a 1230 is a really good score. It is way, way above average nationally, okay? But it might not be a helpful score for someone who is intent on going to College Park. As you can see, it's about 150 points short of the 50th percentile. It's not even at the 25th percentile. So barring something extraordinary, this is a student who will shield his scores from College Park. You can probably guess what's next. All right, here's our third student, right smack in the middle of those other two. Now, at first blush, you might think this student will decide to shield. Why? Well, 1350 is a little bit short of the 50th percentile. It's a little bit below average. But more than 9 times out of 10, what Gracie or I would advise is the opposite. We would tell the student to send his scores to College Park, because even if they aren't exactly at the 50th percentile, they are solidly within the middle range of what Maryland is expecting to see. And a 1350 provides a useful data point that instantly communicates to a college that you can do the work there. All right. And so I'll give you this as a starting point when you start to do your own college research as individual families. Jump online, try to find what the average scores are, and most importantly, what the 25th and 75th percentiles are. And here's my rule of thumb. If you're scoring somewhere north of the 25th percentile, if you're like here or to the right, there's a good chance you're going to end up sending your scores. Okay. Now, if you've listened, you've probably heard me say expressions like there's a good chance and 9 times out of 10 and almost certainly. And that's because the decision to send scores is really, it's both art and science. Okay. The science of it is what we've just looked at. Okay. You're going to start by looking at like the national numbers and the averages at a college and seeing if you fall into that middle range. But what you want to do before making the ultimate decision is talk to your college counselor, okay? Because you want to also take very local factors into account, like how do your scores match with your transcript? Do they make sense? Are they sort of on par? Are the scores even better than your transcript, or are they not quite there? And you also will probably want to get on a software program like Naviance and start to look at how BCC students with your scores have fared in admissions over the last 4 or 5 years. If you've spent any time on Naviance, you know that they have these infamous scatter plots with the X and Y coordinates, right? One prong will measure your GPA and another will have your SAT scores. And that's a very quick and dirty way to see how people from your school typically fare. So there are a lot of factors to consider, but I strongly recommend you start by getting these 2 boundaries, because that'll give you some really good context school by school. Gracie, I'm going to give it a pregnant pause in the hopes that maybe you have a question to share.
Yes. So we have one. How do you think test optional scores benefit or don't benefit students with learning differences?
Okay, great question. So if you're the parent of a student with a learning difference, okay, I don't think there's a black and white answer here. Odds are, if you do have a learning difference, you'll qualify for some kind of accommodation, most likely extended time and maybe some other elements. For many students who fall into that category, getting those accommodations makes all the difference. And that more than levels the playing field for those applicants. And they end up earning scores that are useful to them and scores that they share with a college. For some students with certain types of learning issues, even the accommodations may not be quite enough for that student to shine in the best possible light. And if that's the case, you'll end up shielding your scores. But maybe there's a bigger point to be made. Parents, when we were kids, first of all, almost no one was diagnosed as having any kind of learning difference. We just did what we did. But the second thing is, when you did encounter someone who was aware of having a learning difference, it was the kind of thing we were quiet about or uncomfortable about and silent about. That's really not the case anymore. In almost every instance, I would strongly recommend that someone who's overcome a learning issue share that in a college application with the institution. It's an opportunity to turn this into a positive, not a negative. And it might also be a great opportunity for someone to explain why they didn't share an SAT score. Because a timed multiple choice standardized test does not aptly measure my abilities, particularly given this, specific learning difference. So I know I've approached it at every possible angle. But bottom line is, I don't think students with learning differences are going to be impacted disproportionately here. All right. Gracie, I'll take your silence to mean that's all you have for now.
That is all I had for now.
Okay, great. All right. My screen is taking a second again, but I will be back with you in a second. The slide is just catching up.
I'm also happy to screen share in the next minute or so. Oh,
Thanks. Let's see how we do here. All right, I think this is where I want to be. Just want to wrap up the test optional part of our discussion by looking at a quick bar graph. This graph shows you the acceptance rates at a handful of very competitive schools last year, juxtaposing those who applied with a score against those who applied without a score. And what you can see is that universally, students with scores in the dark blue were admitted at a higher rate than students without. Okay, this probably doesn't shock you. Okay, and I want to be really clear. I'm not suggesting that the dark blue students were all admitted because of their ACT scores. That's not what I'm conveying. Probably the same students who had scores also had put together some really strong college applications and were on top of their game and had all their academic ducks in a row. But I think this does highlight a point I've been trying to make, which is scores can break the tie. And oftentimes that's what college admissions is about, is breaking the tie. And I will make one other point. If you end up being someone who doesn't send scores, perfectly fine. But keep in mind that without a standardized test score, that's going to put even more of a premium on all the other elements of your college application, right? So you want to make sure your transcript looks good. You want to make sure you've written great college essays, okay? And you want to make sure you've taken rigorous classes, because you're just withholding one piece of information. All right, I'm going to totally shift gears. We're going to hit a topic that is relevant during COVID, after COVID, and was relevant years before COVID. And that is, how do you figure out which test you should sit for as a student? Okay. And I present the choices to you in multiple choice format to make it familiar. We've tried to help students and you all as families make this decision by giving you mock exams at BCC this fall. A couple months ago, many of you sat for a full-timed mock ACT. Last Saturday, you took my mock SAT, and in October, you took a PSAT. These practice rounds are meant to help you ascertain whether one test conveys a greater advantage for you than another. Okay, it's great to figure that out. Okay, it saves you a little bit of effort and anxiety. But I want to make one really important point. If you get this decision wrong, okay, if you think you're an SAT person, but that doesn't end up being the case, it kind of doesn't matter in this regard. These two exams are about 80% identical now, and maybe possibly 20% different. They've actually never been more similar than they are in 2021. And so what that means is, if you study in earnest for one of these tests, I can promise that whether you intended to or not, all that good work will absolutely carry over onto the other exam, and vice versa. To give you an idea of how much I feel about this, for the first 17 or 18 years that CapEd has been in existence, I always ran separate courses for the SAT and the ACT, because I thought the two tests were different enough to merit different curricula, okay? We do not bother with that anymore, okay? In the Gracie era, okay, we have only run one course. And at the end of that course, okay, the students will take the SAT or the ACT or both, because the content overlap is so profound. And I'll be honest with you, a solid majority of our students, those who sit in our courses and work with us for a couple of months, will pick choice C here. They will take both. And it's not because they're gluttons for punishment. It's because in a test optional landscape, you don't have anything to lose by trying them both. If your SAT score is better than your ACT score, you'll end up sending the higher one. And if the reverse is true, you'll send that one. And if you're happy with how you did on both, you can very happily and very nerdily send both. But no college is expecting both. And I really should have backed up to make a super important point. There's not a single college in the United States that prefers one of these tests to the other. Colleges will be equally happy to receive either score, especially during test optional times. They'll be thrilled to get anything from you. So don't worry about like taking the right test for a specific college. They are not going to care. Gracie, anything on this front yet? I know we just started talking about this.
Not yet.
Okay. All right, just let me know. Now, after talking up the similarities, let me highlight a couple of differences between the tests just to be responsible. Okay. The differences are generally in this space down here. Okay, in the middle. Here's the first content difference people notice. The ACT has a separate dedicated science section. Okay. It's 40 questions long. Okay. It tends to be pretty densely presented with a lot of charts, graphs, tables, and scientific terms. It's the section most students like the least before they prep. They're least comfortable with it. The SAT has never had a science section, but in a not so subtle way, College Board sprinkles 36 scientific questions all over the test. So to give you an idea, 2 reading passages on every SAT are scientific in orientation. And at least a dozen math problems test the same charts, graphs, and tables that you find on the ACT. So I'll admit this section may be intimidating at first, but you don't want to pick your test out of a love or a hatred of science, because honestly, you're going to have to do like the exact same amount of science on either exam. Like you're not getting a free pass one way or the other. Here's the second content difference, math. The ACT is about 1/3 geometry, which for parents shouldn't seem all that surprising. Like we all took geometry in high school and we'd expect to be tested on it. But what the SAT has done on its most recent iteration is cut down geometry to 5 or 7 questions per test. That's it. And instead, they've doubled down on Algebra 1 and Algebra 2. And so the upshot is ACT tends to feel like it tests more subjects more broadly and superficially. SAT feels kind of the opposite, like it's fewer topics in math, a lot of algebra, in greater depth. Okay. But Gracie and I have been doing this a while, and we help students navigate this all the time. You're going to be hard pressed to find any student who like picks their exam because they really like the Pythagorean theorem or not. The thing that it usually comes down to is the feel of the test and the pace of the test. The ACT, if you ask students, often feels a little less tricky, a little more straightforward, a little less wordy, but it's way more difficult to finish because they pack many more questions in. There's something like 40% more questions on the ACT than the SAT. It's a huge difference. For some students, this is a non-issue. If you have the kind of student who just like powers through tests, doesn't second guess himself, just kind of does the exam and doesn't think twice, your son or daughter may not mind the ACT pacing at all. But if your student works a little more slowly, a little more deliberately, likes to look over their work, they may find the ACT to be a little disorienting and uncomfortable. But honestly, as I kind of hinted at earlier, I wouldn't make that call with a chart. I would try practice tests and determine from there whether one test is really much less comfortable for your student than the other. One last point on this. If you notice up top here, you'll notice there's some talk about essays. The SAT has had an optional essay on it for the past 6 years. Last June, the College Board dropped it from the exam. It's not there anymore. It's gone. And that's because you'd be hard pressed to find any colleges that even recommended the essay, let alone required it. The ACT has not followed suit just yet, but you're not going to find any colleges that care about that essay. So my strong advice for any junior and current sophomore on your way to being a junior, sign up for the test, but don't worry about writing these optional essays. And frankly, the essays were just like cruel and unusual punishment. They weren't particularly hard assignments, but after you've sat around for a 4-hour standardized test, the last thing you really want to do is whip out a fresh pencil and start writing a handwritten essay at the end. So thankfully, that is something you really don't need to worry about anymore. All right, Gracie, I'm giving a pregnant pause for you.
Do you recommend, we touched on this slightly, but do you recommend that students concentrate on one while they prep or that they take both?
I think if you can figure out which test is your better fit, you can primarily prep for that test and plan to take it. But I think for most students, it's really wise in the back of your mind to remain open to taking the other exam. So if you think the SAT is your test, great, prep for it, okay, take it. But you may very well want to take an ACT after doing a lot of good work because it may really surprise you. And I've been doing this forever, okay? And you know, Gracie, you're a lot younger than I am, so you're like half of forever. But we often have a sense for which test is going to be better for specific students. But even after doing this for a lot of years, we still get surprised sometimes. So to me, it doesn't make sense to close too many doors at the very beginning of the process. All right, beautiful. So let's dive into some score reports now. I'll try not to get into too much minutia, but I do want to point out some salient features. We're going to start with my sample SAT score report, a document you probably just received in the mail or will receive in the mail awfully soon. Okay. If you look at the top right of this document, you'll be able to find the student's name, but that's not going to be of great interest to you. The first place you're going to look is the top left of the document, where you're going to find your student's scores. And on the SAT, as you know, the test is half verbal and half math, with 800 being a perfect score in each part. So this student earned a 520 in verbal, a 540 in math, a 1060 altogether. And by the way, I picked the score report for a reason. 1060 is like the total average SAT score for a college-bound senior. That's what an average 12th grader on their way to college scores on the SAT. Okay. But after looking at the scores, I'd recommend looking down the left-hand side to try to get some more specific info. In math, for example, you will find columns with R, W, and B, which stand for right, wrong, and blank. Okay. And this will allow you very quickly to identify specific strengths and also specific weaknesses, areas that are giving you more trouble. And that's really useful as you start to plan test preparation down the road. You'll have a feel for which areas are going to require a little more attention from you. Okay, so again, right, wrong, blank. And by the way, the percentage is just like literally the percent answered correctly. It's nothing fancier than that. Okay, the bottom of the form, this lists all of your answers on the test. It's like a miniaturized Scantron. So it may be a little hard for you to read on small screens, but what you'll notice is a plus indicates you got something right, and a letter highlights that you guessed something wrong. So the more letters you find at the bottom of your report, the more trouble you had with the test, the more questions you answered incorrectly. So if you can read it, I think I can make it out. This student has A plus dash plus D. That means number one, she picked A on incorrectly. Number two was a plus, that's good. Number three was a dash, which means she skipped it. 4 was correct. And on 5, she incorrectly answered D. So if your student is highly motivated, they can go over every single question that they got wrong on the test. And what we also included in your envelopes were answer keys. So you can compare your incorrect responses with the correct ones that are on that document. Okay. Last area of the form. There's this big chunky space here for comments. This is an area that we've programmed our computer to work on for us. Basically, it will list a bunch of mistakes students make that fall into identifiable patterns. And I'll be honest with you, this section is really meant for students who are taking the 2-month classes that Gracie and I run. They're not really meant for one-time testers, but if you have individual questions about any aspect of your score report, the comments or anything else, that's a great reason to email us or call us, and we'll be happy to literally walk you through line by line and help you make sense of your student score report to help your studying moving forward. This is my score report, okay? And again, many of you all have already received it. Now, last week, students were able to get score reports that looked like this, which are their PSAT score reports, okay? And you'll notice a lot of the same features, but let me point out a few things. The top indicates the student's overall score, 1220. That total score is split up into the verbal and the math components. And just to clarify on the real test, they call the verbal evidence-based reading and writing. It's kind of a mouthful, but that's what that is, verbal and math. They also do one more type of subdivision, which my report does too, but I'll show it to you here. On the verbal side, they split your verbal score into 2 halves, a reading score and a writing score. If you look carefully, you'll notice that this student's reading and writing, Felix's scores, are exactly the same, which means he's equally adept at reading comprehension as he is with editing and grammatical rules. One more little mystery about these numbers. If you add a 0 to these subscores, the 32 in reading magically becomes a 320. The 32 in writing becomes a 320. And when you add those up, it sums into a 640. Okay, which is kind of neat. The math is broken down similarly. The 580 is expressed as a 29. So this allows you to very quickly see that Felix is better at both verbal topics than he is at math. This very busy page is just like the bottom of my answer sheet. This page lists every question a student answered and compares their answers with those that are on the answer key. They do one extra thing that our report does not do, and they have this little column here for difficulty. So if you find like 3 boxes of difficulty, that's one of the harder questions on the test. Just from looking at this difficulty column, you can tell pretty quickly whether your student is someone who's missing a lot of the easier stuff, maybe because she's working a little bit too carelessly or quickly, or missing a lot of the harder content, which means your test prep probably should center on ways of tackling those difficult questions. Big picture, the PSAT, the Cap Ed Practice SAT, neither one plays any role at all in college admissions, 0, okay? Colleges obviously never see my score report, but they also never see your PSAT score report. Here's what these tests are designed to do, guys. They're designed to give you a really accurate snapshot score, meaning when Felix got a 1220 on that October PSAT, he would have scored a 1220 on an SAT that same day. When my anonymous student scored 1060, that's what the student would score on an SAT that same day. So you want to take the scores seriously because they're accurate. But I can promise you this, basically every single student who tested on one of these exams is going to do better on the real thing because they're going to have more school under their belt. They will have read more, okay? They will have more brain development. And if they follow the advice that people like us are giving, they're also going to formally prepare. So you shouldn't feel married to your PSAT or practice SAT score in any way. As a matter of fact, I think you want to focus more on how you got your score than on the numbers themselves. All right, let me pause here for a second and see if we've got any questions on score reports, either the minutia or bigger picture ideas.
Yes. So we have a couple of questions that are similar. So the first is for the subsections where it has the percentages. How can you determine where you need more work versus less work if there's a certain threshold in those percentages? And are there any sections that are more likely to improve with test prep?
Wow, great questions. Okay, so let's go back to my score report for that because I think we're a little more detailed on that front. So you're going to look at right, wrong, blank, and then percentages. The question was, is there like a certain threshold or cutoff where you should worry? The short answer is no. I think the percentages really should be looked at in a relative sense. Okay. If you're someone who's scoring a 1000 on the test, you're getting about half the test right. So a percentage correct that's well below 50 is one you might worry about. But if you're a stronger tester to begin with, which many students are, if you're starting at 12 or 1300, you might be more concerned at a percentage that's like 65 or 70% because you're expecting to answer more questions right. So I don't think there's one particular number that's like an automatic red flag. Although this student has a funny one. If you look closely here, in Geometry Plus, which is geometry and trig, this student has 0 right and 7 wrong, which I'm guessing is because this student has had almost no geometry and trig as part of their high school experience yet. Second question, I think I can give you a more satisfying answer. We found through the years that when people take our course, our average improvement is about 160 points over 2 months, okay? It's actually a median. So half our students are a little bit below there and half are a little bit above there. But almost everyone who engages in this seriously, we find goes up between 100 and maybe 250 points, okay? The improvements tend to be pretty even by the time the prep is done. But we definitely see faster improvement in some areas and slower improvement in others. So for example, in math, particularly in the algebra and algebra 2 categories, we usually see pretty quick improvement because we have a number of very useful strategies there that people can master pretty quickly that generate instant points. I also find that in writing, that grammar tends to be very learnable very quickly because they keep testing the same subset of grammar rules. And once you've mastered them, you're probably going to just keep getting those questions right moving forward. So I think we get our biggest bounce out of those 2 areas right away. An area like reading comprehension, okay, in the verbal, is an area that's going to just take longer to generate an analogous improvement because we have to change more habits, right? We have to make students literally rethink the way they read and answer questions. Completely learnable skill as well, just not one that they're going to be able to like dramatically transform in one single lesson. It usually takes a few weeks. Gracie, anything else? Those were two good questions.
Yes, when we're taking into account of test optional schools, how can we think about this decision when a student might excel on one part of the test, but not on another part? So say they do really well on math and they're still struggling on verbal.
Great. So when we were looking earlier, and I kept talking about the 25th and 75th percentiles, I was presenting those as total scores, right? The whole SAT score out of 1,600 points. The whole ACT out of 36. It's a very useful way to use those ranges. But if you are someone who has a more pronounced split, you'll be able to find 25th and 75th percentile numbers for the individual scores. Okay. So maybe you're someone whose math puts you in the 50th percentile, but whose verbal puts you in the 30th percentile. That's probably still worth sending. But if you were in the 50th in math and the 10th in verbal, that might be low enough that you wouldn't send them. But this is a complicated decision too, because it can also relate to what you're studying in college. If you're a STEM student, if you're looking to go into an engineering program, your math number is going to matter an awful lot more than your verbal number. And so almost 9 times out of 10, you're sending scores because they're going to want to see your math proficiency. If you're a big time humanities person, okay, a writer, the editor of your school newspaper, someone who writes poems, straight A's in English, you may be going to a particular humanities program at a college and your verbal score will matter more. So I don't want to give you like a hard and fast rule, except to say, look at these percentiles for verbal and math separately as well as combined. Great questions. All right, I'm going to keep going. Let me talk about timing. So unbelievably, it is Christmas already, okay? And we are at December, either of 11th or 10th grades, depending on your situation. Please notice my test taking timeline here is for juniors. If you are a sophomore, okay, unless you've got an extraordinary circumstance, you should not be engaging in test prep or thinking about a real SAT or ACT for quite some time. But if you're in 11th grade, obviously that's not the case. Every year we see more and more juniors test in the fall, which is fine. But the overwhelming majority of students, okay, are going to test second semester of junior year, usually among the dates I just flashed on the screen. And to be even more precise about it, the most popular test dates for 11th graders, specifically for BCC students, Whitman, Churchill, March for the SAT, April for the ACT, the early to mid spring. This allows you to have a lot of school under your belt, to be pretty old in a relative sense, but it doesn't test you at the very end of the year when school pressures tend to hit. What Gracie and I see most often is students prepping with us starting in January, like right after the holidays, prepping into March and April, and taking one or both of these tests. I think here's the goal. We kind of want to get you guys to the end of 11th grade with at least one score in your pocket that you're reasonably happy with. If it's your dream score, that's awesome, but it needs to be at least representative, all right? Solid, okay? A decent reflection of who you are. Because you're going to be looking at colleges very seriously at this stage of your high school life. And as you're looking, you're going to want to figure out whether these SATs and ACTs are going to be helpful to you, okay? You're going to want to see where those numbers put you at the colleges you care about. And based on your investigation, you're going to also want to figure out whether to test again. For those students who end up being serious about their testing, after testing once or twice in junior year, almost all of them will test one more time in 12th grade. And the most popular combination of dates, if March and April click the box in 11th grade, it's August and September in 12th grade, okay? SAT is usually, I think this year it's August 27th. ACT is going to be September 10th. These tests are early enough that they don't get in the way of like college applications, okay? They don't even get away to school, actually, because school has barely started. The only downside to these exams is you got to study over the summer. If you're a sophomore, you're going to probably be choosing among 3 different times to potentially study: the summer before junior year, the fall of junior year, or an even more popular time, which is the winter of junior year. And while these are the most popular test dates, if your extracurricular life flips this around, totally fine. It's not like one test date is magically easier or better than another. I'm just kind of showing you what tends to be the norm and what the logic is behind that. Okay. I paused there, Gracie, but I feel like you don't have anything for me.
I do not. I picked
Okay.
up on that pause.
All right.
Oh, actually, sorry, one quick question.
Sure.
Even though the majority of these students are juniors, are this year's classes open to sophomores?
Yeah, I mean, we will make sure before you join a course of ours that you call us and we talk to you at length to make sure we understand why you might be starting your prep early, what's behind that. We will give you our professional opinion about when we would recommend starting, and you can follow it, or if you want to start a little bit earlier or later, that's, we're not going to fight you. In the end, honestly, maybe more than anything, you just want to make sure your student is interested and willing and ready to engage, because this test prep takes a while. I actually want to show you what a typical course of ours looks like, just to give you an idea. Hold on, we froze up again, but the calendar should catch up with us soon. Okay. Sorry to make you wait, guys. It shouldn't be more than 30 seconds, though. Okay. So here's what I wanted to show you. This is a sample calendar for one of the courses that we're going to be running this winter. This is not one of the courses Gracie runs, but it'll give you an idea for how we organize things. This course meets every Sunday for basically 2.5 months for 4 hours at a time. We are purposefully running for a long period because we want to structure enough hours with students, not only to teach them new ideas, but also to get them to practice in a supervised setting. By giving us 4 hours on a Sunday, we don't need to give them very much by way of homework. As a matter of fact, there's almost no homework associated with the course. And when we meet with students, we group them into classes of no more than 10, according to their scores and their strengths, so that we make sure that we're teaching the right material at the right pace, which is so important. You don't want to jump into a class where people are just randomly thrown together, because invariably people will get left behind or end up being kind of bored. The other thing we do is every 2 to 3 weeks, we administer full timed mock exams that perfectly simulate the real test. We'll score these like I showed you so that we can analyze strengths and weaknesses. But just as importantly, we're trying to give students the chance to take these things in a simulated environment to take the stress and uncertainty out of the equation. There aren't going to be a lot of surprises on test day. Everything else is optional. We have a makeup night for people who miss a required weekend. And we also have over Zoom extra help hours that are conveniently running at 3 different times every Thursday, so students can jump in for math or verbal help in specific topics. We run an outstanding course, and obviously we'd love to work with some of you if you're interested. But I mostly wanted to show you this to point out the fact that for most students, it tends to take between 2 and 4 dozen total hours to prep effectively for these things, okay? 25 to 50 hours. And if you plan that out over several months, it doesn't have to take over your life in any major way, but it is, a significant time commitment. And no matter how you prepare for these exams, in a class like ours, with a tutor, studying on your own, your prep should really involve 3 ingredients, okay? It should involve relearning and learning actual content from earlier in high school. It should also entail mastering some new test-taking strategies to handle some of the hardest questions you find. And finally, it should get you a lot less anxious and more comfortable by exposing you to practice tests. So it's content, techniques, and practice testing. And if your preparation includes all 3 of those ingredients, you're going to be in pretty good shape when it comes time to take the exam. All right, I am coming up on 8 o'clock. Gracie, if there are any last questions in the chat, I will happily hand the floor over to you.
Okay, great. So do you see any can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, for students who may be young for their grade, do you see any benefit in waiting to test?
Great question. So I do think there's a maturation element at play here. Okay. Like there's a difference between testing in August of 11th grade and August of 12th grade. Like a year makes a big difference. That's one reason why people usually test more than once. If we're talking about a few months here or there, I wouldn't worry. I think I would prioritize your extracurricular life, like how busy you are outside of school, over your exact chronological age, unless you are really like 1 or 2 years younger than your classmates. And then that's a different conversation.